This is questions. Let me know. I got to do the mic so we can get it on Zoom. This is hopefully a dialogue, not a lecture, again, of stuff that you had, so we really want to get to those answers for you. Carson.
Thanks for the introduction, Meg. It's great to be with you all here in Logan. This is one of my favorite recurring workshops. Here's all the work that the legislature is going to make you do or has already made you do. So with that said, we'll just jump right in. Please don't hesitate to ask questions. The way I envision this working, we've got a ton of slides. There's a lot that happened in the land use space this year. So we've got a ton of slides. I don't necessarily, we'll just kind of keep working through them. If there's anything you have questions on, please don't hesitate to ask, and we'll kind of pause and do a deeper dive. But I want to make sure everybody kind of feels at least comfortable-ish with the concepts. There we have a lot of information on House Bill 368. I know all of you have read that bill backwards and forwards a couple times now, but hopefully we'll be able to answer some questions there. Unfortunately, Jerry Tingey, our legal director, who is probably the only buddy in the state who really, truly, genuinely knows that bill in and out, is down in St. George presenting to your attorneys today. So you'll get to do with the B team here, and we'll probably have to punt on some questions and get you answers later. But with that said, we'll just go ahead and jump right in. I always like to start with this little guessing game. We've got a couple data points here for those of you who attended our annual conference, or our mid-year conference. No spoilers, but can anybody guess how many bills were introduced, not adopted, just the number of bill files that were introduced this year? Any guesses? You can just toss them out. 950? Very close. 962? A little bit warmer. The number is 959 bills introduced, which for those of you keeping track at home is 134 more than the annual rolling average. So if you look back 9-10 years, the numbers really started ticking up back in 2018. Cooled a little bit during 2021 for obvious reasons, but then we're right back up setting records. Next question. How many substitutes and amendments to those bills were adopted? And for those of you who don't know, that's basically how they change bills. That's a harder one. So I'll just give the answer here. 1,110 substitutes and amendments adopted. There were some bills, like the first one we'll talk about today, which had, I think, 8 or 9 different substitutes. In many cases, sometimes substitutes are fairly technical, minor changes. A lot of times you'll have substitutes that rewrite the entire bill. In some of these cases, you'll have substitutes that quadruple the length of the bill. And add a lot more complexity. So this number is almost more concerning than the previous number. And it was actually 6 fewer than last year. So we were starting to see, once we get into session and drafting attorneys have to keep working through it, you're starting to see hitting that headroom there. We had ULCT track 279 bills that directly impact local governments. And not even all local governments, just cities specifically, which is pretty staggering. Those aren't all planning bills. Those aren't all, that spans everything from law enforcement to retirement to land use, but many of these were in the land use and planning space. 40 land use bills? Yep. That's a lot, yeah. And I'll leave I don't know the numbers off the top of my head about how many lines they added to LUDMA this year, but I will leave that to Will for later. And then the legislature ended up passing 582 bills this year, which is just a couple less than last year. Frankly, there was some drama in the Senate this year at the end that kind of postponed stuff, but they were actually on track to set a new record prior to that. So with that all said, we're just going to go ahead and jump in. We'll start with transportation. I tried to pare this down to bills that are really specifically affecting planning, but I'm sure there's a lot more that are probably on your radar. So first bill I want to talk about is Senate Bill 195. This is one of those bills that started off a little bit complicated, got simpler, became more complicated, then became way more complicated as more provisions were added, specifically targeting Salt Lake City. But one of the core pieces of this bill, this was in, I think, finalized in the 4th substitute, maybe the 3rd substitute, but there was a lot of conversation this year around traffic circulation. This was actually specifically born out of concerns about canal crossings, but we heard, as we talked with more legislators this year, we heard a lot more questions about well, if cities aren't connecting their roads, then that pushes more traffic onto the state highway system, et cetera. Partnering with WFRC and MAG and some other local stakeholders, we were able to push on this provision. And I think this ended up more in a planning space than the initial preemption, which was just going to require cities to connect all of their roads over canals. That would have been extremely cost prohibitive. So where this ended up was a new component to your traffic circulation element of your general plan. By 2027, so you have a little bit of runway, by 2027, all local governments within an MPO boundary are going to need to prioritize traffic connections. So that could be footbridges over canals, that could be roads over canals, that could be roads where just no roads are connected right now. But it's up to you to determine which of those connections are your priorities for your city, which of them make sense, which of them don't make sense, and you can select any number. You have to select, yeah. Sorry, Metropolitan Planning Organization. So if you're in WFRC, Wasatch Front Regional Council's boundaries, or the Mountain Land Association of Governments boundaries, then this requirement applies to you. Yeah.
So does this apply to, do you anticipate this would possibly extend to other MPOs outside of WFRC and MAG? Not this law specifically, but could you foresee that this does go out to others?
Other cities outside of that? Maybe. I think right now this is specific to some urban traffic circulation constraints. So I don't know in the future if it goes out that far. It's possible, but.
Hold on, Will.
Oh, you're right, cash would be too. Yeah. Sorry, yeah. If you're, yeah.
Sorry. It includes the cash MPO and the
Sorry, Dixie. Yeah,
what,
you're
the
right.
one
Yep.
that's down in St. George. I forget what that's called.
Yep, you're right. So yeah, cash and Dixie as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're in an MPO boundary, to have to do this by 2027. I don't expect this being pushed on other cities in the distant future.
So it doesn't apply to RPOs, is what he was saying.
Yeah, only metropolitan planning orgs. Yep. So there'll be a couple of these bills where if you're not one of these specific cities, you don't have to worry about it. Yeah. So, but the general premise here is that you prioritize these connections. You don't have to start engineering any work on that, but you have to figure out, estimate how much they'll cost. So, and that's not necessarily a formal, like a consultant's estimate. It can be, but you have to have some kind of number with some kind of methodology for figuring out what that cost is. Yeah.
So if you have a transportation plan, can you just reference that in the general plan? Or do you have to put the whole transportation plan in the general plan?
So you should have a traffic and circulation element within your general plan. That was an existing requirement. This isn't going as far as a complete transportation plan. This is really just trying to say, we want you to start thinking about these. We want you to start thinking about these connections, basically. So it's not. This doesn't go as far as a requirement. It's really just, yeah, do some work to think through it. And we had a lot of back and forth because legislators want to see some urgent action on these connections. Obviously, there's a significant cost if you have to build a bridge. There's a significant cost if you have to condemn some right-of-way or an easement over a private canal. So we basically said, we don't even know what the costs are. Let's let local governments and MPOs work together to figure that out and then provide some additional information.
Carson,
Yeah.
I mean, that's a good question because it really makes things confusing. General plan is supposed to have a transportation and circulation element. Your general plan is general.
Yes.
And your transportation plan is probably going to be something that's more specific based on the policies you've got. But this bill requires you to include now in your general plan cost estimates and potential funding sources, which is not something you usually put in a general plan.
Yeah.
But here it is. It's a requirement now.
Yep. And you'll start to see, at the end, we'd like to have some, well, at the end of the next session, we'd like to have some more conversation about the role of general plans more broadly because general plans, like Will said, are becoming less and less general by the year. And this one, again, is not a super rigid requirement, not as detailed, but just basically think through what the next steps would be if you were to complete some of these priority crossings.
Any other questions on that?
All right, the other part of SB 195, well, there's many other parts, but the other part I'll talk about today is the station area plan, basically calling it like a check-in with your MPOs. So if you are a station area plan city, you're not all station area plan cities, but if you're a city who has a fixed guideway transit stop, then you already have an existing station area plan requirement. That station area plan requirement already has, you have to have an implementation plan for that specifically. A lot of legislators this year were concerned that cities weren't actually taking the steps of implementing their station area plan. So to get better information, get better data, demonstrate that cities are taking station area plans seriously, now there's a requirement that every 5 years after certification, you have to submit basically a report to your MPO saying, here's the work we've done to implement it, or here's where we're still missing, here's where we need to go. You can modify your existing implementation plan, but that's not a specific requirement. So basically just report to your MPOs every 5 years after adoption. If you have multiple station areas, you can submit, you just basically compile all those reports together and do it in one, but that's up to your preference. You have to do that for up to 15 years. So every 5 years for up to 15 years. Any questions on that? Excellent. And I won't go into the very complicated Salt Lake City traffic planning parts of this bill because most of you are not from Salt Lake City, but there's a whole lot more to this bill that, yeah, we'll skip over. And then I've got a couple of things here about economic development. A lot of these are housing and infrastructure tools as well. I kind of wrapped them all into economic development because of the tax increment component. The legislature has kind of been more and more interested in tax increment policy this year and last year. So there's a couple housing things here that, yeah, you'll see that. So this is kind of a couple quick overviews. How many of you remember the first home investment zone tool created last session? Excellent. That was more hands than I got at a couple of these updates. So basically, the first home investment zone, or FIZ, was a tax increment tool designed to help facilitate centered development. So you might have you'll have like a center area that has a higher land use intensity, mixed use, and then you can actually wrap in less intense areas around that, count that housing towards the density of the center, and get the tax increment for infrastructure. This tool doesn't work everywhere, and prior to this session, this tool wasn't really working anywhere because of a glitch in the formula and code. But this is just kind of a quick recap of what the FIZ is. Are you all familiar with the Housing and Transit Reinvestment Zone? Okay, a couple. So this tool really only, again, applies for cities with transit, which is not every city in state by any stretch. But the HTRZ was designed to facilitate, TOD, really high intensity development around transit stops, around town centers, city centers. So this might not apply to most of you, but this was sort of the first of these tax increment housing bills passed 2 or 3 years ago. And then the HOPS was, again, another tool created last year. This is the Homeownership Promotion Zone. Any familiarity with this one? Awesome. You guys already are way ahead of me. This is great. So the Homeownership Promotion Zone, there are smaller changes to it this year than some of the other bills, but this was a new tool created last year to help facilitate smaller projects. They have to be under 10 acres total, lower intensity development than the other tools. These could be used in urban Utah, rural Utah, suburban Utah, pretty flexible. Don't kick up as much tax increment, though, as the other tools do. And the reason I'm recapping these is all of these saw some changes this year. So the first one I want to mention is Senate Bill 23. This makes some changes to the FIZ. I won't go in depth here, but basically this fixes the formula that made the FIZ untenable before. So now, basically now the FIZ actually works. The denominator works properly. They did go through on all of these bills and change the definitions of moderate income housing and affordable housing to make them more consistent. Those definitions change every year, so these wouldn't apply retroactively. They only apply going forward. Senate Bill 26 did some similar changes for the Housing and Transit Reinvestment Zone. If you already have an approved Housing and Transit Reinvestment Zone, these wouldn't apply to you. The other thing this did, again, only really applies in Salt Lake, is this created a new tool called a Convention Center Reinvestment Zone, which is for the Salt Palace specifically. But if you open up this bill and are surprised to find hundreds of lines of code, that is the reason for it. another tax increment tool for economic development in its specific targeted area. Senate Bill 241. How many of you have PIDs in your city, public infrastructure districts? Okay, a couple. If your city allows PIDs, I'm not going to go into the details of this bill because it is pretty darn technical. It's not, there's not a lot of policy changes to PIDs, but a lot of small technical changes. But you should make sure if you have a community development director, an economic development director, your city attorney, make sure whoever's really working with the PIDs are aware of these changes because there are some technical changes to the election process, to the governing document process that you should just be aware of. So rather than belabor everybody with this one topic, I'm just going to kind of keep moving on, but please make sure that you're aware of this if you have them.
What bill number was that? I'm sorry.
That was Senate Bill 241 from Senator Stevenson. It's really, yeah, the big changes are on that kind of election process and how you're governing that. Senate Bill 250 is another pretty darn technical one. This is more related to CRAs, so I'm not going to spend much time on this one either. But what you should know is that if you're either within 15 miles of the Salt Lake City, the core inland port project, or if you have if you're in a rural area and you have one of the auxiliary sites, this allows the tax increment for housing to be pooled and used by a nonprofit, which I believe will be UAC. I don't know if that's been formalized yet, but basically it'll allow that housing to be used outside the project area within a 15-mile radius. Sorry, Utah Association of Counties. Good clarification. Yep. I use a lot of acronyms. Please don't, if you're like, what is that? Yeah. So again, a lot of changes to CRA code here you don't need to worry about. Just be aware that there'll be more potential housing money flowing outside of the inland port area themselves. Senate Bill 262, like I mentioned, homeownership promotion zones are new. This bill started as technical changes to homeownership promotion zones. It went through a couple different iterations before ending up here. There's some interesting code. It allows legislative bodies to do basically consent decrees, which is a hyper-technical issue for one city in particular. And there's a provision here I highlighted. It requires counties to comply with land use provisions for all pending applications. Basically what that means, that it's only in Title 17, it's not in Title 10, it's not in LUDMA, but in Title 17 it's going to require you, anytime there's new legislative changes, you're going to have to apply those, if the applicant wants, to those projects unless they've been finalized. That doesn't apply most of the time. Most jurisdictions that I'm aware of already do that, but basically the applicant does invest in your process. They vest in state law as much as they choose to. Senate Bill 280, again, kind of a hyper-technical economic development bill, but one of the interesting things about this is it allows retail incentives to be used for those retail incentives. One of the exceptions where you can use them is for mixed-use projects that used to have to be housing on site with the commercial, but now you can use that up to a quarter-acre radius, which just gives you, if you're planning a project and you want to use incentives to anchor a commercial area, or if you want a commercial center around the housing, that gives you a little bit more flexibility as you're planning out. You can offer incentives to that retail facility in that site. Senate Bill 328. This was the annual omnibus alcohol bill. Normally these bills are very technical and don't really have much intrigue to them. This year, several of the substitutes actually allowed a local government to waive the alcohol proximity requirements to parks and playgrounds. In other words, if you are trying to attract a restaurant, or if you're planning for a restaurant that's near a park and the restaurant wants to sell alcohol or sell cocktails or mixed drinks, right now there's a proximity that you have to meet before you can allow that. Several of these versions change that. This year, the annual technical alcohol cleanup bill actually failed a vote on the Senate floor, which is the first time I've ever seen that happen. It was later brought back the next day without the proximity language, but that little provision to help local governments facilitate redevelopment better ended up becoming a great controversy in the Senate, and yeah, I've not seen a leadership bill like that fail in a while.
Carson, I'm wondering if we should jump to the housing stuff just because we have like a half hour left. And
Yeah, it's probably.
there's probably going to be questions there. The slides will be available. We're available. We've, again, done webinars that we have on our website. So we're not trying to gloss over stuff, but we want to get to the content that you may have questions on this morning.
Yes, thanks, Meg. The one last economic development one I'll mention is Senate Bill 337. Many of you probably heard about this bill. This bill would have created the Beehive Development Agency, which would have allowed a state agency to basically create project areas, economic development project areas. They would have got land use and planning authority, tax increment authority. Basically, they would have usurped local decision making in those areas. They could be as large as anybody wanted. So this was a pretty alarming bill for local governments. Another version was dropped, another substitute was dropped towards the end of the session that would have allowed local, or required local government consent prior to these project areas being created. But the bill still ended up kind of imploding, never even received a hearing on the floor. So we expect more conversations about this, but obviously we're concerned about the implications for local land use decision making and planning. All right, now here's the stuff you actually came for, not just me talking about economic development. I'm going to skip over some of the moderate income housing plan stuff because I know that'll be addressed in Zach and Wilf's presentation. And we're going to focus more on, let's get into parking. Senate Bill 181, everybody's favorite subject. So this basically tried to standardize parking stalls. We started off this session with this being an issue. We've talked to our policy committee extensively about it, so most of you are probably aware. But there's two major pieces to this bill. Part A is standardizing parking stall sizes in moderate income housing plan jurisdictions. So if you are not a moderate income housing plan reporting city or county, you don't have to worry about this. If you are, it now says that your default is covered parking stalls that are 10 by 20 feet. Uncovered parking stalls, so outside, not in a carport or garage, those are 9 by 18 feet. In your development agreements, you can still negotiate for larger parking stalls. It does not affect the number of parking stalls that you can require, only the size of parking stalls. So if I am submitting an application that has a garage that has a unobstructed 10 by 20 feet area, that has to count towards the parking requirements. In other words, you can't say, here's a garage, but we're not going to count that if it meets this size. Any questions about that piece? Yeah.
Coming. Hold on.
Yeah, the question was, I'm assuming all legislators have small cars. I would guess most legislators do not have small cars by seeing the parking garage, but yeah, that's a good point, and we had a lot of back and forth on this one. I think I think that local governments will probably still end up doing a lot of this through development agreements, trying to right-size it, because we have seen cars increase in size every year. Like a typical F-150 is now about 21 feet. Even like a Toyota Corolla is larger than it used to be. So yeah, car sizes are increasing. We surveyed, some of you responded to that survey, a lot of cities, and found that most cities were actually not too far off from these parameters already, but a lot of cities are updating their codes to increase the sizes to facilitate larger vehicles. But good, excellent point. Yeah.
Hi. So in my city, we have the front setbacks for housing. We don't have, a setback for the uncovered, but we do count uncovered parking. So right now, it's at 25 feet. Obviously, we need to change some things, but we need to change it to 18 feet. Is that what this is saying?
That is an excellent distinction. So this is saying you can only, like, if you require a parking stall size, you have to count that. So it's not saying you have to change your setbacks, but what it's saying is you can't require them, or if you, you'd have to count parking within that if it's larger, but you can't require the parking stall specifically to be larger. So if the setback is just larger and the driveway has to connect, it wouldn't actually change that, but in your development code, you can't say we require a parking stall size of 25 feet, if that makes sense. So that's a great point, though, and I'm sure we are going to hear about that this coming interim from cities who are like, well, our setbacks say this, not our development standards for parking. Great point, though. All right, the other piece of this, and this does apply everywhere, so not the second piece of this is not just moderate income housing plan cities, but it does require you, well, it says you cannot require a garage for affordable owner-occupied housing, and that's housing sold at 80% of area median income with at least a 5-year deed restriction. It could be a longer deed restriction, but basically, yeah, you can't require that garage if it's one of these projects. There's not very many developers doing 80% AMI 5-year deed restriction housing. There's a couple projects that I'm aware of that might meet this criteria, but in most of those cases, the land use authority has already waived the garage requirements because they're pretty small. And this only applies to single-family detached, townhomes, and duplexes. So be aware of this requirement. If a developer comes in with that kind of project, then yeah, you would have to waive garage requirements. Yeah.
Do you have an application for this to apply this? Looking at this week the language actually doesn't say 80% AMI. There's a definition in that section that defines affordable housing as housing that is priced at 80% of the county median home price, which is different than AMI.
Sorry, that's a good, yeah.
And then once we realized that, we started to think, well, what is the data product that we use for that? Because the ACS with the Census Bureau has median home value, which is different than a price, and we assume that's a sales price. So then are we bringing in realtor data, or do you know what the intent was as far as how to source that information?
Yeah, and you're right. Sorry, that's a good distinction. Yeah, so the statute's open to it, and there's a couple of areas of code that now say 80% of median home sales price. I'd say it's open to you to get the best data that you can. You can find it on Redfin. You can find it on from realtors. If you contact the Realtors Association, I'm sure they'd be happy to provide it to you. If you contact the Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute, I believe they have it as well. So yeah, just find the best information that you can in determining that. All right. Well, out of the frying pan into the fire, House Bill 368. We've got lots of time for House Bill 368, so I'm going to jump right in. You can see just kind of the laundry list here of everything that House Bill 368 affects. And I'm not even going to go into annexation because, frankly, Wilf can do that much better than I can, and it doesn't really change a whole lot outside of Salt Lake County. Yep. But that is about, I want to say, 30% of the bill, Wilf, by volume. All right. Well, we're going to jump right in. Identical floor plans. So the goal here, so there's already been in code for a while, I don't know how long, but there's a pre-existing piece of code that said you have to charge a lower fee and expedite identical floor plans. It didn't define what identical was. It just, basically had that requirement, and as cities moved away from physical card file systems, that became harder to do with digital systems and digital submissions. So the goal of this provision was try to address a lot of the ambiguities there, provide some clarification, and create a more formal process. So really what this is doing is saying if you have two buildings with no structural differences, structural is not defined. This is one of those use your best interpretations, but think of it as like moving where walls are, moving where entrances and exits are, things that could not be affordably changed. Like these are major components. And use the term substantially identical now instead of identical. So again, it's giving cities some discretion, but trying to, there's really no way to completely 100% spell it out. So you know the intent of it, and that's to,
Hasn't the state adopted the International Residential Code?
Yes.
And so
Portions of it, yeah.
portions of it. Could that act as default? If not, in reference to any of the structural, some of these definitions that aren't spelled out in the law?
Yeah, I don't know. I know that we had some conversations around that, and there was some reason that they didn't point to the IRC specifically. I think it was just, it's really clunky anytime you're referencing IRC, because you have to reference the section code. Yeah. So, Yeah, I think if something in IRC says this is structural, you could probably safely say this is how we're interpreting structural.
How many of you already sort of did this in some shape or form? Okay. Great.
So I'm actually going to go to this. I'm going to go to the process first because I think the process helps a little bit. So the idea here is that if I'm an applicant and I know I'm going to be doing a bunch of these, maybe I'm a production builder and I just have 3 floor plans that I use. When I go to the city for the first time, I'm going to have to mark it as I'm going to use this as an identical copy. So I have to flag it, and I have to identify which zone in the city it's in, or which land use area it's in. And then the city takes that, says you've identified this as an identical plan, and I'm going to flag it somewhere in my system, and I'm going to give you an index number going forward. So I'm going to say, this plan you've given me is plan 15 or 15. This is plan 15. Here's your number, and the next time you want to come, just give me this number, and I'll know what you're doing. So then I'm an applicant. I'm coming back, say, hey, this is the same I did last time. Here's the index number. I'm giving you all the information you need to tie it in your system. And then, I have to also identify that it's in the same zone. I can't do this over here if it's in a different zone and then over here. The city could probably have that discretion to do if they wanted to, but the code says at least it has to be in the same code for the city to be required to do the identical plan. That basically makes it a little bit easier. And then there's specific timelines that cities have to follow now. So rather than the whole plan review timeline you have for other projects, you have 5 days to do the review, and you have to do it at 30% of the original fee. So the idea here being that you've already seen this, you've already approved it, you're really basically just making sure that these are consistent with things you've approved before. It has to be within the same IRC generation, so if the state updates IRC significantly, which I don't foresee them doing, I can't be like, well, this complies with the new IRC, so I want to use the old plan. So it has to be updated there. We've talked to a lot of inspectors about this. They feel like 5 days is sufficient for them to do a lot of the technical code compliance and checking. So yeah, this will be tough for a lot of you, I know, and you will have to prioritize these within the scheme of all the other priorities that the state has given you. So just be aware, make sure you have a system to facilitate these, but just be aware if you see that somebody's flagging things as identical, you need to give them an index number, and you need to do the expedited review. Questions? Awesome. Oh, I should also mention there is a penalty for applicants who knowingly submit incorrect floor plans. I think this will happen a lot more unknowingly than intentionally, but if you have somebody who's a really bad actor, you can penalize them, but just make sure they're a really bad actor and not just a confused small builder who's like, I think this is about the same, or I made a last minute change. All right, here's the really fun stuff. Plan review timing. So the genesis of this provision is so how many of you were around when we passed the 14-day review timelines? Most of you, excellent. So that was a big contentious policy a couple years ago, and every year we hear builders coming back and saying cities are not following the law because they're not processing our applications within 14 days. Well, I'd say 80% of the time that we follow up with those claims, oftentimes it's for other deficiencies or somebody just didn't respond to somebody in an email, but oftentimes the result of those claims was that somebody submitted an incomplete application, didn't see a follow-up email, or the city didn't send a follow-up email, some communication breakdown, but basically the plan was never considered complete, so under state law it never had to hit that review timeline. Like basically that shot clock never started. So to try to resolve these disputes, we created a completeness review. So this is separate from the 14 days, this is before the 14 days, but it's a 3-day review before that starts. So yeah, or a screening period, completeness review, whatever you want to call it. So the idea here is rather than a substantive review, when you get an application, that 3 days starts and you have to figure out if all of the pieces are there. You don't need to figure out if all of the pieces are correct, but you need to have all of the information ahead of you because you can't review for substance later if you don't have all the information. So that's the goal here. Once you've completed that 3-day review, if you take 1 day, if you take 2 days, you need to let the applicant know that it's complete and you're moving into that next window. There are some subsequent provisions. If you think everything's there, you start working through it in the 14 days, you find that it's not all there, there are some provisions where you can kick it back to the applicant, toll the clock, but it's going to be a lot simpler for you and for everybody involved if you just make sure that everything's there in that first 3 days. Let's see, Jared put together a good slide here. So yeah, you can see this is just kind of an example. If you follow along this little arrow on the screen here, in this example, the application's collected on day 0. You look through it all, you say, yep, they've got everything here, all of our forms, everything's great. Yeah, so that's kind of the same deal. And then let's say you get, you think everything's there, you get halfway down the path, you discover that everything is not in fact there. So you need to let the applicant know immediately that they need to submit new information. You have to say specifically what it is they're missing. So you can't just say, we need more information from you, let them know what it is. And I know this is something that cities generally already do, so for most of you, this is just formalizing existing practices. So you let the applicant know that it's incomplete, and then what we do is we actually give you additional time, so you can toll that time. So if the applicant takes a day to get back to you in that 14-day window, then you get additional time to review it. So if they take another day to say, here's that final paperwork, sorry about that, then you get an additional day on that 14 days. And then as you get closer to the end, so there's that last 5-day window, and if they are missing key pieces there, then you get additional time. The logic there being that as you get closer to the end, there's, like, you can't do any of the final reviews until you have all the pieces, so there's more time if an applicant is missing something on the very end of the step. Clear as mud? Yeah.
And we have these slides for you too, if this
Yes.
helps as well.
And Jared has, we have, if you go to our website or our YouTube channel, we have webinars on this where, again, Jared Tingy, who understands this all much better than I do, actually goes through and explains it in more detail, and you can pause the video recordings and see more information there too. Yeah, Mike.
Did they anticipate any increase in the cost of building permits to take into account for some municipalities the 3-day screening process? Or was the assumption that that's already happening, so this is just formalizing it?
Yeah, I think when we talked to some plan reviewers and some building inspectors, they felt like 3 days was sufficient time generally. That might be different in rural Utah. But I think, yeah, if your current staffing is not able to meet these requirements, then I think it's reasonable to increase fees and say, we did not have the resources to meet state code. To do that, we had to raise fees so that we could hire more staff to do it. Again, you just have to make sure, code is pretty specific about building fees and how you set them, so you just have to make sure your methodology is solid there. But again, I think if you clearly need more staff to meet the timelines, that's pretty reasonable methodology in my mind. But just be prepared if somebody gets upset, just be able to defend it. Yeah.
So Carson, do you want to maybe go back to that first list of everything in this bill? And we only have like 15 minutes left, which, and maybe if there's a crowd choice or ones that are burning questions on any of these that you have, otherwise we can keep marching through them. But if we really want to get to ones that you may want more clarity on, or any pieces of this that you have questions. All right, just oh, okay, got one.
I was wondering on the noticing, I found that, and I don't think that, as far as I know, this was affected, but some of the noticing as it pertains to, you have an area that you have to give the noticing within, and in some cases you have to mail notice to everybody within that area. I found that very vague. Do you have any thoughts on, say you are adopting a land use regulation that's applicable to the whole city, does that mean you have to mail notice to everybody in the whole city?
Yeah, so that was a oversight when with the total notice, like the noticing overhaul bill, was that 3 years ago, Meg?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so that was sort of an unintentional piece that we discovered when we came to the APA Spring Conference in Vernal and tried to figure out how to work through that. So this year, the way it changed is not necessarily a big policy shift in that, but what we're saying is if it's quote unquote ministerial, so if it's a citywide policy, if it's a amendment to get consistent with state code, if it's things like that, then it's just a Class A notice, so you don't have to mail to the affected area. I think if it's a major zoning, like if you're changing all the zones in your city or if you're allowing new uses everywhere, that might trigger the affected area. I would talk to your attorney about that.
Yeah, so Class A and Class B, and so we modified those. And so if you're doing that latter one, it is still a Class B, which does have a definition of affected area, which is different than affected entities that we're all familiar with under the general plan noticing. So the affected area, of course, is in a different section of code. So it's not in LUDMA, but there's a hyperlink to it under the Class B notification. So that one still is the big kahuna. We didn't get that one fixed, but we did hopefully fix these, which is any text amendment, any update to state code that's a requirement, multiple zoning districts, boundary adjustment for annexation, so recodification. So we're hoping this was an attempt, but that there was still a sense that if you're doing something that broad. But if it's a state code amendment and affects all zones, then perhaps you use this process. So hopefully that gives you some direction.
Yep, good clarification.
Any other questions on noticing? Anyone used this new one or interpreted it yet for a project? Okay. So if you are, I still think Class B is still in there, the Class A and Class B. And Class B is the one where you had to notice. Tony, I think you guys were considering going through this, right? And you have to mail to not only property owners, residents. It is a big list to find under affected area and quite prohibitive. That would be if you did, I think your question was multiple, a rezone that affect like the entire city. So that one still would be a Class B.
Does everybody know the difference between Class A and Class B? So Class A is basically just posting it on your website, posting it in like publicly visible areas, posting it on the state public notice site. Then Class B is a step farther. Class B is all of Class A plus mailing to affected properties or affected areas. So that's the big distinction. Again, a couple years ago, the state code went through all of the different noticing requirements that are all over state code, and they were a mess, frankly. And they came up with a massive bill that consolidated everything into those two notices, which is why you see some of these requirements that don't necessarily fit planning very well.
Okay, 10 minutes. Any other takers off that list? Okay, Carson, what would you pick of? We've got one more to do, maybe.
What to do? Let's see.
Oh, bonding. Oh, that'll wake everyone
Well,
up.
do you want to jump into the Slido questions really quick, or do you want to?
Yes, let's do that quickly. We'll do a little change of pace. As you know, every meeting we do a Slido question. That's our LPC trademark. So for those of you who haven't used Slido, you pull out your phone, you look at this little QR code, and we're going to ask you about what we can do to help for technical assistance. You know, with subdivisions, there was some money available. The state is sort of, one of the things that Cameron and the team has negotiated is trying to get assistance to implement some of these state mandates, and we'd like to ask you.
Yeah, so we will ask for your name in case we have follow-up questions on these, but the first question we want to ask is, what changes to municipal code should we look at pursuing next year? This is not saying that we'll be able to get those by any stretch, but what things should we start putting on our list to try to address through land use task force or through other various processes? And I'll mention that in land use task force, we already know where the private sector is starting, and they're starting with a not quite overhaul, but darn near overhaul of LUDMA. So yeah, we want to, if they're starting big, then we want to make sure that we're addressing things that local governments need to have fixed.
And the land use task force, everyone familiar with what that is and how that works within the framework of the league? Come on, somebody has to have heard that. Land use task force. One person? Okay, then we need to explain what that is. So it's a coalition that we've had for several years now of property rights owners, municipalities, and the county representatives trying to work through land use issues in the interim. And so that we have some sort of consensus by the fall, or at least know there is no consensus. And this has been going on for several years and will continue and start up again later this month. 2 weeks, woohoo. So,
Yes, and the Land Use Task Force is the group that reviewed things like House Bill 368. That was where, 368 was the result of a lot of the negotiations in Land Use Task Force, I'll say that. Awesome, looks like we still have some people typing. And if you have thoughts that are longer than you want to type out and slide out, that's totally fine and understandable. You can reach out to me. My email is keilers@ulct.org. I'll throw it up on the end here. But feel free to email me if you have additional thoughts, or if you get back home and think, oh, hey, I wish I'd mentioned this. This is a huge headache in Ledma for us. So we welcome that.
and for all the webinars that we are been referencing, Alexa's going to let you know where to find them.
Yeah, it's on our website, ulct.org. You can navigate to the events tab and click on spring training, and then you could see all of our slides, including the detailed HB 368 webinar that Carson referenced.
And people on, I don't know if this is screen sharing on Zoom, but if people listening online, all millions of you, want to just like drop in the chat box ideas, then I'm sure we can collect those too. All right, still see a few more people typing. This is excellent.
And we know there'll be some that say none.
Yes, I'm expecting that. Maybe even half of people. All right, we'll give about 30 more seconds here. I really need to work on like my crowd work or something for waiting for slide out responses to come in and fill time. All right, that's been 30 seconds on my watch, so I'm going to move ahead. Sorry to everybody who's still typing frantically. So the next question we want to ask, what sort of planning technical assistance does your city and or town need? And the reason we're asking this, and you might just say everything, but the reason we're asking this is we are well aware that there are more and more requirements being placed on planners specifically every year. The state is looking to local planners to solve more and more state and national level problems every year. So we want to make a more concerted pitch for planning technical assistance. So whenever they pass a new bill like House Bill 368, maybe you're provided with resources to help implement it. Maybe you're provided with more technical assistance for making housing plans. Whatever model you think would be really helpful, we're all ears. We want to make a major push for planning technical assistance this year. So we really welcome your thoughts on what would be helpful, what resources. We're still very much in the brainstorming phase of this.
And also just another shout out on for the planning and Governor's Office of Planning and Budget, GOPB. Laura Hansen of that shop has just put together a great funding resources page. It's under planning and coordination, and it has grants, assistance in all areas, not just land use, but water and other things. So that's another site to look at for some comprehensive funding resources.
See, we'll give another 30 seconds on this one as well. Alrighty. We've got one last question for you, and I'm going to move over to that. So the last question is, do you have examples of innovative housing and mixed-use projects in Utah that should be highlighted? And the reason I'm asking is we're working with the governor's office to try to highlight some of these really cool projects that local governments are doing. It's funny because we hear these examples every year, and oftentimes, we'll have like 2 or 3 case studies where and like one example is Mill Creek Commons, where they've done an excellent redevelopment effort that includes housing and really a community center in their downtown, really making a downtown in Mill Creek. So it's a really cool project, and we talk about that a lot, but we know that many of your cities are doing these kind of cool, innovative projects that just never get any attention and never get any highlights. So we really want to be able to say, look at all these cool things that Utah cities and towns and counties are doing, and be able to bring those to the forefront. We want to be able to collect information on them, use them as examples for other cities, towns, counties, to say, well, this thing that I saw in Mill Creek doesn't work in my community, but look at this cool thing that's happening over here. So again, just trying to build out a list of like things that you're excited about. These could be housing projects, these could be new commercial reinvestment areas, or just projects, but just things that you think are really cool, planning things happening in your community. We'd love to hear about them. If anybody even just wants to throw anything out, then we welcome that. While we're finishing here, we have 5 minutes left by my watch. Are there any other questions on legislation that you have that you'd like to be addressed going forward, or any other thoughts that you'd like to leave us with? Yeah.
Yeah, a few thoughts. The state used to have something called the Rural Planning Group.
Yeah.
And then a couple years ago, there was the local administrative advisors. I would actually suggest that the state start like a team of roving planners that can assist local governments. And the reason why is because they can look out for the public interest. And there's a lot of policy ideas that aren't getting down to be able to assist cities because we're getting legislation that it's not always looking at it from the technicalities that cities have to deal with, and the planners can mediate that, and they can do it in a way that can look out for the public interest of the cities and then provide them additional assistance because they're slammed, right? So, and then the other thing is there's a lot of movement towards, the issue of homeownership and trying to resolve how to make deed restrictions enforceable. I gave a presentation on related issues yesterday about homeownership for multifamily, and that we could really use the support of the state to support all of those policy options so that we can move homeownership into multifamily, and deed restrictions, figuring out how to enforce those would be a key part of that. So,
excellent thoughts. Thanks, Brandon. Really quick, I'm going to leave this open while I switch over to...
And then just, we will shift sessions, but if you choose to stay with us, which you hope you will, we're going to, in the next session, get into what's on the horizon for this next session and talk about the state housing plan, how you can and can't get involved, and other things like that. So it's more of a dialogue and a forward-looking session.
Yep. So yeah, with that said, we can let you all go. I have my email, Justin Lee, our head lobbyist's email, and Cameron Deal, our executive director's email, all up on the screen. If you have other ideas, like Brandon's idea of a roving planning assistance, please feel free to shoot them to us. Again, we really want to make this a priority, and we're still just trying to think through what works, but I think policy always works best when it comes from the people who actually deal with it, rather than us up on the hill just coming up with arbitrary ideas. So thank you all for being here. Thanks for participating in Slido. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.